hand it over to Dr. Mark Melnik, who is the Economic and Public Policy Research Director for the UMass Donahue Institute, and he's going to talk about, put some of this into the broader macroeconomic context. So, Mark.
Morning, folks. My name is Mark Melnik. I direct economic and public policy research at the Donahue Institute. And while Sarah's setting this up, I'll do a little introduction on that. First, I'm going to talk to you all today about the Massachusetts economy. For those who are unfamiliar with the Donahue Institute is a public service and economic development arm for the President's Office of the UMass system. And in that, we touch a lot of different aspects of civic and social and economic life around the Commonwealth. Some of that's pretty backstage work, folks doing things in early childhood education or job training for workers who are disconnected from the labor market. The group that I lead, though, Economic and Public Policy Research, does a number of consulting research projects for clients all around Massachusetts, New England, and national. I think the name UMass puts a lot of our work in Massachusetts, but allows us to really have a macro and micro lens on what some of the big core issues are in the economy in Massachusetts. Separate from that, we produce a journal twice a year called Mass Benchmarks. And Mass Benchmarks takes academic and quasi-academic work and frames it in a public policy context for understanding some of the things that are happening in Massachusetts. That times up really nicely with what today's invitation is, and what I've been asked to talk about is the state of the Massachusetts economy, where it's been over the last decade, and the core punchline is that over the last 10 years, the Mass economy has been growing substantially and has been and is one of the envies of state economies around the nation. But because I'm talking to MassTLC, it's important to highlight that one of the big driving forces, and for puffing you guys up, is the importance of technology and knowledge-based industries in driving some of the economic success that we see in Massachusetts right now. So in today's presentation, what I'm going to do is a highlight of some of those core things that we see going on in the Mass economy. What are some of the driving features of that growth that we've been seeing in Massachusetts over the last 10 years, including our growth in knowledge-based industries, the investment in research and development that we see that is quite unique and special to the state, our well-educated labor force, and the attraction of foreign-born labor to our state. And some really interesting new trends to highlight there. Despite what I'm saying, in all of that, the experiences in the Mass economy, however, are not evenly felt. We see significant differences both geographically and demographically, and those challenges are critical in trying to understand where our economic growth is going in the future. And then importantly, and I'll highlight at the end, some of the big public policy issues that Massachusetts faces right now. Tom highlighted them as a part of the survey that MassTLC did, but you can't talk about the Massachusetts economy right now without talking about the combination of transportation, housing, and the costs of living in this state. Depending on where you are or which group you're talking to, that conversation shifts a little bit, but that's the key underpinnings of it. You know, I live in Natick, which is 15 miles from here, and I had to leave an hour before the meeting just to be sure. And luckily the traffic wasn't bad today. But that you know, when you go to turn on the pike going east, and you're like this, okay, am I going to stop right here, or what's going to happen? And it's a good problem to have on some level. Secretary Pollock would often joke at the Transportation Commission that I've served on that Detroit doesn't have traffic jams. It is a product of your success in some level. So anyway, let me dive into it. Unlike Tom, I do have dozens and dozens of charts, but I will move quickly through them. The time element that we have with a very robust program also, we'll leave only a little bit of time for questions. If you have questions for clarification, I'm happy to take them as I'm moving. Separate from that, Sarah will share our slides later, and I'll walk through the parts that are most relevant to you all right now. So this first map here looks at population growth in the U.S. by state between 2010 and 2019. It's a little bit hard to look at in a very large room, but what I'll call your attention to is the northeastern part of the state. The northeastern part of the country. Massachusetts has been growing about 5.3% since 2010. That's a little bit below the national average of 6%. But as you'll note, Massachusetts is probably the only green thing that you see up in the northeastern. It is the most dark green. What that means is that we are growing faster and more substantially than any of the other states in the Northeast. If you look around the map and you see where the bright green is, a lot of people are running away from winter. Not terribly surprising, although this one wasn't so bad. What we see overall is Mass is a growing state, especially relative to others in the Northeast. Now, what drives population growth in Massachusetts? Well, the critical story in population growth in Massachusetts is that almost all of our growth in the state, and in particular Greater Boston, over the last decade, over the last 2 decades, has been the increase of foreign-born folks into the state. This trend line is a little different than I've showed in the past because it shows a couple of really interesting things. But just to highlight, since 1990, 90% of labor force growth in Massachusetts has been with our foreign-born communities. Since 2000, almost all of our population growth has been with the foreign-born. This graphic here, let me break these into pieces. The blue line is domestic migration. And as you'll see, this is 0, right? So Massachusetts is a net loser of domestic population year over year. We have more people who go to other states than folks who come here to live from other states. The only time that was not under 0 was during the recession. People kind of hunkered down, had less financial security to feel like they could move around, but for the most part, we're a net loser at domestic migration. The second part is our natural increase. That is the balance between birth and death. That stays pretty consistent over time, although it's ticking down a little bit. So we do gain on whole, but that has been changing over time. In fact, Maine actually this past year had more deaths than births. So older states tend to see this increase go down. Mass has 3 problems when it comes to natural increases. 1, we are an older state compared to all states in the union. 2, we are a very well-educated state. So as a well-educated state, we tend to have smaller families, particularly with a well-educated female population. Third, labor force participation for women is extremely high in Massachusetts. So those 3 things together mean that we just don't make as many babies here as you might see in other places. So our natural increases are very modest. So the big driver is international migration. We rank historically and traditionally in the top 5 of states in terms of percent growth of foreign-born communities, which peaked in 2017 with 50,000 net new immigrants to Massachusetts. So this is a huge driver to our population growth. What is really telling why you use this chart now is that the latest data came out at the end of December, and you don't need an economist or demographer to show you, boy, that looks interesting. So in the last 2 years, what we've seen is the actual net increase of foreign-born folks in Massachusetts has gone down by 40%. So we're about down to 30,000 net new, which meant in 2019, we almost gained no population in the state at all. And I think a big part of this has been kind of a cooling effect that we see in federal policy. It's critical as it relates to how we grow our economy. And for the folks I'm talking to today, the amount of foreign-born labor that you may rely on, this is a big story for our growth going forward. I just like this graphic. It's cool. It's the same thing I just said, but it is the New York Times did this right around the new year, and it was the population gains with and without immigration by state. It's a little hard to read because we just did it as a picture from the Times article. One of my staff members was interviewed for that article. But as you can see, Massachusetts, they estimate a slight decline in total population, but when you add in the immigration, we have a significant increase. Mass is a leader in job growth in the Northeast. We, since 2010, have grown jobs about almost 13% compared to a 14% on average for the U.S. We're a little behind the U.S. on job growth, but I would note part of the reason for that is that we were hammered less hard during the Great Recession than other parts of the U.S. So we didn't have the same need for the kind of balance that other places will. But we do stand out among all Northeast states, and as you can see, several of which are lagging at half the job growth of the U.S. overall. This next graphic looks at unemployment in Massachusetts compared to the U.S. A couple things I'll draw your attention to. On these kinds of screens, it's a little hard, but there's this gray that we do here. That's the recession 2001, and this is the Great Recession. The thickness of the bars shows just how long that recession took place. What I'd like to highlight here is just the historic trend of where the Mass economy stands relative to the U.S. And dating back to the beginning of the millennium, we've always stood out as having a stronger economy than the US and having a lower unemployment rate. A couple things to highlight. Relative to us in the US, the dot-com bust of 2001, 2002, that actually hurt us worse relative to the US in the Great Recession. That was a much more localized and unique hammering of our economy than, say, the Great Recession. The Great Recession, what happened was a lot of construction jobs were lost, a lot of manufacturing jobs were lost. These weren't things that we had in great abundance in Mass. We have some, but the knowledge-based industries weren't hit quite as hard. But what I'd like to see here in this trend line is that, you know, we tracked kind of close to the US unemployment rate, and then as the Great Recession kind of ended, that difference between Mass and the US really widened. And now we stand today with an unemployment rate of just a hair under 3%. So why does Mass stand out so strong to the US? Part of it is because of our combination of industries in the state. On the left, you see the concentration of industries in Massachusetts. On the right, you see the concentration of industries in the US. The big things to highlight here, we have a strong concentration in healthcare and social assistance. It's not terribly surprising with some of the world-class hospitals that we have in the state. We have a significant concentration of education, and we think about all the great universities, UMass in particular, that are around the state. What I love to highlight is professional and technical services, which means absolutely nothing to anybody who's not a nerd. Professional and technical services, the Bureau of Labor Statistics speak for high knowledge consulting and other kinds of professional activities such as biotech and different elements of high tech. Information industry also includes some of that. The tech industry is, the Bureau of Labor Statistics isn't really caught up on things like tech and bio and green because it takes them like 10 years to come up with good definitions for these things. So they're kind of cut across some of these major sectors. But those are ones that stand out special to Massachusetts. One other thing is that we are the most educated state in the country. About 44% of Massachusetts residents have a college degree. In greater Boston, it's over 50%. And that's a big driver of some of these knowledge industries that we're talking about, including tech. So what does that lead to, and how do these industries grow? A lot of it's in the investments that come back into Massachusetts. This graphic here shows the top 5 states in the US and NIH funding that is received. On an annual basis, Massachusetts receives close to $3 billion a year in NIH funding, which equates to about 10% of the total allotment that the federal government hands out. For 25 consecutive years, Boston has received more NIH funding than any other city in the country. And what's interesting about Massachusetts in particular is that the way it's flipped. In California, a lot of it's going to the universities. In Massachusetts, a lot of it goes to the hospitals. But we rank second, we've been second for a long time. But whenever I show this, I like to highlight that California's cheating because it's the size of the country. So when you do it per capita, now we take off. And Mass is number 1. When we talk about policy threats to the state, though, this is another important one to highlight. Any changes that you would see significantly in federal policy as it relates to funding for this kind of research and development could have a huge ramifications on our economy. Tom highlighted during his talk about the spin-off effect that we see in tech. Not just in the jobs that are maintained by employers, but what is supported through business-to-business spending and consumer spending. So anything that changes here could have ramifications for us. One example, just a couple of years ago, it was floated in the Trump administration about diverting NIH funding for border wall, funding of the border wall. That was a half dozen different funding ideas for a border wall ago. And not one I think that was ever terribly serious, but it is worth noting that any kind of changes to elements of this kind of funding can have a huge impact on us. This next one talks about the share of the state government, state economy that is research and development. I am just highlighting the same thing I was saying before. Mass stands out as a leader among US states. I like using this graphic though because New Mexico's on here. And I do these talks all the time, and I very rarely get to mention New Mexico. Los Alamos Laboratories and Sandia National Research Laboratories are in New Mexico and receive a lot of federal funding, a lot of research and development. So that's where New Mexico is this weird outliers in this presentation. Another driver is investment in venture capital. This is just one simple measure from PricewaterhouseCoopers, but in Massachusetts we've seen a dramatic increase in investment in different companies in entrepreneurship. A lot of it in healthcare, internet, and software over the last several years. Highlighting again for tech, and one of the things that we've done for Tom and the team over the years is looking at the rankings of different state technology and science indices, and Mass, again, ranks among the leaders, both in terms of research and development, tech concentration, workforce, and number one again in the composite score. So I think the big moral of the story is I hit on these things is that the mass economy is doing quite well, and the tech industry in particular and knowledge-based industries are huge drivers of what's going on. Related and interestingly is Logan. And it's funny to get the laughs because I laugh too. Because every time I go to Logan, I'm like, this is a miserable experience. I also have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, so it could be their fault. But in fact, the first time I flew without them, I was like, oh my God, this is like reducing the level on a video game. Like, so it's like somebody should be holding on to my legs. But one of the big things about Logan is the increase in traffic that's been going on in Logan, in particular international travel. We're one of the fastest growing airports in the country. One of the things we learned in a project we did with Mass Econ a couple of years ago was the number of businesses that were picking Boston, picking Cambridge, picking Eastern Massachusetts because of Logan and because of the ease to get to Europe. And which was very surprising to me when we were considering Charlotte, but it was going to be harder to get to France, and we needed to be able to get across the ocean quickly. Interesting, and a big selling point, especially for folks who might complain about going there. This is the same graphic, same idea. I just love the map. So what we highlight here is on the blue is our international destinations in 2010, and on the red we highlight our international destinations added since 2010. It's a tough room to look at, but you see a lot more red than blue. And in particular, we had almost no international travel to the Middle East or parts of Asia, which are now things that are offered. Okay, all those great things aside, we do see some signs of slowing. This next graphic, which has a lot of bars on it, so it might be a little hard to look at, but what we're seeing here is, I want to call your attention to, is just the far right and the fact that job growth has been decreasing or at least slowing in Massachusetts. Not terribly surprising, and there's two reasons for that. One is that consumer demand appears to be slowing a bit. That is a concern. The second, and a different kind of concern, is when you have an unemployment rate of under 3%, it's really hard to grow jobs. We have high labor force participation and very few people on the bench. So population growth is a critical part of continuing to grow jobs. So that's going to be a slowing factor. We do a quarterly board note out of Mass Benchmarks, which I mentioned earlier. When we did the one in September, there was a lot of concerns about what was going on in the economy and what we thought was a sluggish start to 2020. And in part because of instability with some of our trade partnerships around the world and some of the other things that are happening globally, which I'll mention in a second. Come December, that kind of rebalanced a little bit. A couple of Brexit seemed to have a bit of a conclusion to it, or at least moving towards one NAFTA as well. So that seemed to stabilize. This graphic here is just the AIM Business Confidence Index, and we see that same trend where business confidence did seem to tick back up again at the end of the year. But there is some grounds for, okay, we're on good footing right now at the beginning of 2020, but we keep being concerned in Mass Benchmarks about what we would call unpredictable or unstable things in the economy overall. We're walking into an election year. There's an impeachment thing happening. I'm not sure if you guys heard about that. So all of these things could have an influence on where the economy goes long term. This next graphic just talks about some of our biggest trading partners in Massachusetts. And what I just like to highlight is that when you look at who our biggest trading partners are for things that we create in Massachusetts, a lot of these countries are places where there is some level of instability, whether it relates to their own economy or their relationship to the U.S. Canada and Mexico, obviously, with the renegotiation of NAFTA. China, again, I'm not sure if you've heard much, but sometimes we have conflict with China over trade. Germany, there were some concerns about the German economy slipping into recession. So these are all things that are not huge red flags, but they're the kinds of things that nerds pay attention to in thinking about, okay, where's the economy going in the near term? So now while I highlight all these positive things about the mass economy, I should note in the second half of this presentation gets at that the economy is not performing the same for everybody. And in particular, we see significant demographic and geographic differences. Again, another chart that's a little bit hard to look at, but I'll draw your attention to the things that are most important. While I highlight how great the Mass economy is doing, the Mass economy is doing particularly great in Greater Boston. And if you disentangle Greater Boston from the rest of the state, the experiences can look quite different. I highlighted at the beginning of this presentation about the importance of professional and technical services in driving our state economy. Things like tech, things like life sciences and bio. This graphic here shows both the size of the employment of an industry, the size of an industry in your region, and then its growth over time. The important thing here is that the upper right talks about industries that are strong and industries that are growing. So that's where I really want to call your attention to. And what you'll see here is how much things like professional business services in Greater Boston stand out compared to the rest of the state. So it really lags in the other parts of Mass, and it really is robust here. Similar with information, similar for finance, right? So these are big drivers for the state economy overall, but they're big drivers in the eastern part of the state. I'll jump into a demographic slide. While unemployment is quite low in our state, it varies depending on educational attainment. That's not terribly surprising, but what I want to call folks' attention to is the blue line. The blue line is the folks with less than a high school education, and what we see is the unemployment rate for folks with less than a high school education lingers around 8%. What that signals to me, and should signal to everybody, you have an unemployment rate under 3%, but you have segments of your population with an unemployment rate almost 3 times that. What we have there is probably is a skills mismatch, right? And that the skills that those folks have do not match what people in the labor market want. This is another indicator of concern in the economy right there. So we saw this trend line coming down, coming down. What this means is employers are saying, you know what? I need people so bad, I don't care. But then it ticked back up again, right? Is it data noise or is it something real? And that's the kind of thing that we would want to track over time. I mentioned population growth. State's growing about 5%, a little over 5% since 2010. This looks at population growth by county. And what we see is significant differences in your population growth depending on where you are. Suffolk County is growing at twice the rate, or more than twice the rate of the state. Middlesex County growing faster than the state. Essex County growing faster than the state. We have this weird anomaly in Nantucket. Everything else is below the state average. And an interesting thing is we did the state's impediment to fair housing analysis last year, and this is a really localized and new trend. Between 2000 and 2010, Greater Boston made up 45% of the state's population, and it also made up 45% of its population growth. So we were kind of growing evenly. Between 2010 and today, Greater Boston still made up about 45-46% of the state's population, but made up 67% of the growth. So that we see this really localized pattern in recent years of coming eastward. Boston's always been the biggest part, but it's uniquely becoming more and more the biggest part. And this next graphic tells the same story. If we take Greater Boston out of the rest of the state, what happens to the population trend? Greater Boston is growing significantly faster than the rest of the country, and the state lags behind. Employment tells a similar story. We grew 14% jobs between 2010 and 2018. Suffolk grew 19%, Middlesex 15%. And then we see these laggers out in the west and the southeast. You disentangle Greater Boston from the rest of the state. Boston's growing much faster than the rest of the country, and the rest of the state is lagging. So we do see a very geographic trend here. And I'm sure the Secretary, when he comes up here and we'll talk, will mention the economic development plans for the state. In each of the last 2 that the state have come out with has been this focus on how do we grow regional economies outside of Greater Boston, how do we better connect our sectors to the things and the strengths that we have in Boston. That is the big policy question. And I think the one that both has short-term and long-term growth issues for our state over time. Next thing I'd like to highlight is home prices. Here what we did was we split the state into 3 pieces. Eastern Mass, which is effectively Greater Boston, Southeast and Central, and West. There's a lot of numbers there, but the thing I want to draw folks' attention to, this takes home prices from 2000 to 2016. The peak period for most folks was 2006, and then it came down for the recession, and then we saw increases again. In Western Mass, home prices have still not recovered to their levels in 2006. In the Southeast and Central, what we see is home prices that dip, but now kind of come back into that 2006 range. But look at Eastern Mass. So I bought a place in Jamaica Plain in 2008, and my wife and I were like, my dad was floored that we paid that much money for 2/3 of the house. And he was especially floored when I sold it for 10 years later. Just what has been going on in terms of the state economy and in terms of housing. The yellow line is Middlesex County, which has long been the most expensive in the region. And then look at what happened to Suffolk. Suffolk was a significant lagger in home prices. In fact, it looked kind of like Barnstable County, kind of looked like some elements of Bristol. But then over time, just the way it explodes, and now is touching almost exactly on Middlesex. And for folks who aren't familiar with Mass geography, Suffolk County is Boston and a couple little towns. So we are talking about Boston. This home prices issue is so critical when we tell the story of Greater Boston, because it's the ability of retaining talent and keeping young workers. I just sold a house in Suffolk County a year and a half ago and bought one in Middlesex. I'm from Northeast Ohio originally. A buddy of mine loves to send me real estate listings to remind me about how different things are, including the fact that Kyrie Irving sold his house in Cleveland for the same price I bought mine in Natick. And they are not the same house. Another important housing story, I just got 2 more slides. Another important housing story that I want to tell is one of what we call housing burden. Housing burden, as the Census Bureau measures it, is folks who are paying more than 30% of their income towards their housing. This is a piece of work that we did with folks at Northeastern and the Mass Housing Partnership as part of the Boston Foundation's Greater Boston Housing Report Card. On the left, what we have is the percent of folks who are housing burdened by county, so this is Greater Boston, who are homeowners. On the right, what we have is the percent of folks who are housing burdened who are renters. And we do 1999, 2010, 2017. There's a lot to look at there, but there's 2 really critical things I want to highlight. 2010, we see that this giant jump up in the number of people who are housing burdened. It's not terribly surprising because we're really in we're in the middle of the recession, right? So the number of people who are struggling to make ends meet relative to their housing costs are significant, right? So that 2010 number jumps off the page. For owners, in 2017, it comes back down. Again, makes sense. It's still higher than it was in 2000, but the economy is strong, incomes are growing, the number of folks who are housing burden should come down. But look at the renters. For the renters, it jumps up dramatically, and it stays up. The rental market is extremely hot in Greater Boston. And who is in the rental market? Lower income residents, and this is one of the stories I like to tell about Massachusetts, is how to make ends meet in low cost work in a high cost state. But the second part is young workers, and how you can save 20% for a down payment if you're paying $3,000 a month through rent. And that's, this gets the housing production kinds of questions that are critical for economic growth in our state going forward. So just a couple policy things I'll touch on real quick. I mentioned housing affordability, aging population, and attracting and retaining young workers. Every industry in every part of the state is talking about attracting and retaining young workers. The issues at hand change depending on where you are. In Greater Boston, the conversation is always, how do we have young workers afford to live here? In Western Mass, it's how do we get young people to ever come here? What are they going to do? Right. So these are big stories depending on where you are, but it's a critical one for Massachusetts right now because, and for most states, because we have the baby boom population moving into retirement ages over the next couple of decades. So population growth and retaining population is a big story. Investment in public education and infrastructure. As a commercial for UMass, invest more in public higher ed. The secondary point, though, and more importantly, is that Your public university system is training the workforce for your economy right now. We have a lot of wonderful private universities, but a lot of those folks come from all over the world or from other parts of the US. The folks who go to our public universities tend to be local, more likely to stay. Infrastructure, everyone talks about this in terms of transportation, highways, roads, bridges, the T. I served on the Governor's Transportation Commission 2 years ago, and we talked about what transportation was going to look like in 2040. It was an awesome report. It's the size of a phone book, if you remember what those are. But talking about what transportation might look like in terms of autonomous vehicles and the importance of 5G and being able to maintain a fleet of autonomous vehicles. So where transportation is going, but infrastructure is more than that. And so part of it's another part of it is 5G. Another part of it is sewer and water. In this role, I'm surprised at how much I learned about the lack of water and sewer around Massachusetts and what that can mean for economic development long term. Because if we want to talk about housing production, we want to talk about density, then you need to have the water capacity in different locations so that those houses can be built. Likewise, if you run some sort of business that requires a lot of water, are you in the waste management business? Do you really want to be emptying a septic system every couple of months? Or how are you tying into the system? Places on the South Shore, Cape Cod, and out west have a lot of septic. And then the environmental concerns aside. Transportation reliability, I mentioned business confidence and already, and geographic and social inequalities for economic opportunity. And I highlighted already that geographically we see some big differences around Massachusets, and how do we, again, and demographically, and so how do we continue to leverage opportunities for folks around the state. So with that, I'm actually ahead of schedule, so I'm happy to take a couple of questions if folks want to do that, and then turn it over to the secretary.
I just asked you to stand up because we don't have a mic.
Yeah, just a quick question for both you and Tom on both reports. Could you quickly describe how you contact?
So it's inside the report, and I'll apologize, I don't know it perfectly off the top of my head, but it's a combination of industries in information, business and professional services, and I think it's a combination of those two main sectors.
Well, what I mean is, does it include bio?
It does not include
digital health. Does it include like healthcare IT?
Do you recall this, Tom?
I can provide the list of the NAICS codes on the state of tech economy to give you the exact breakdown of that. The tech occupations does cut across all of those industries, and then in the tech pulse, that is information technology companies in our community that we survey.
But it is careful to not entangle bio, but one of to highlight what Tom's mentioning, a lot of these industries, because the definition systems are so crude, and because some of the activities actually cut across industries, that an important thing that we like to do is highlight an occupation as being related to this. This is where the math and the engineering occupations are important for where there won't be in a particular industry, but rather here's an individual who does activities like that. So we made a point of isolating those as a part of the story.
One more quick question.
I'm just curious about the wages and wage growth and all this. Can you parse that out, or is that, it's implied in so much of this, but is that something that you track as well around these industries?
Sure, yeah, it is, and I don't have a slide for it today. One of the things that we've seen, and it has been a common story about this regression, this post-recession period of economic growth has been the stickiness of wage growth and in a lot of ways lack thereof. Now in recent years, we've seen wage growth in a meaningful way, so that highlights one positive. The second, and is really key in Massachusetts, has been we've seen strong wage growth at the high skill industry sectors, but then kind of flat wage growth on the lower skill. So it has highlighted these elements of income inequality a little bit, where folks who don't make a lot of money still don't make a lot of money, and they haven't seen robust wage growth, but the folks who do make a lot of money continue to make a lot. So we saw, one good example is it was a household income category. The only significant changes we saw in growth was at the households making over 100,000, and it was households making, it was like 20 to 30 or something like that. So it was like, so there's kind of this bifurcating of incomes. And again, it is a bit of a concern, obviously, especially in a high cost state, so to speak.
Thank you, Mark.
All right.